Welcome back. Tonight, we're venturing into the heart of Africa's bustling marketplaces, where something ancient and deeply unsettling has been happening for generations. These aren't just stories passed down by elders around flickering fires. These are documented encounters, witnessed events, and very real experiences that have left people forever changed. In the daylight, African markets pulse with life. Lagos's sprawling Alaba International Market, Zanzibar's historic Stone Town Bazaars, Ghana's vibrant Kayetia Market in Kumasi, these places are arteries of commerce, culture, and community. Vendors shout their prices, children weave between colourful stalls, and the air fills with the scent of spices, fresh produce, and life itself. But when the sun sets and the last vendor packs away their goods, something else awakens. Across the continent, from the ancient trading posts of East Africa to the modern commercial centres of West Africa, locals share a universal understanding. Never walk through an empty market at night. It's a rule as old as trade itself, whispered from generation to generation, and for good reason. You see, markets aren't just places of commerce. In African tradition, they're spiritual crossroads, places where the physical and supernatural worlds intersect. The Yoruba people of Nigeria speak of markets as orita, sacred crossroads where spirits congregate. The Akan people of Ghana believe markets are gathering places for ancestral spirits who continue to watch over trade and community. And in East Africa, Swahili traders have long known that certain spirits, the Mashetani, are drawn to places of human activity, especially when those places fall silent. What you're about to hear are 4 stories, each documented and verified from different corners of Africa. These aren't urban legends or folklore meant to entertain. These are real experiences that happened to real people, people whose lives were forever changed by what they encountered in empty markets after dark. Our first story comes from Lagos, Nigeria, where a university student learned why the old warnings about fireflies in markets should never be ignored. Our second takes us to Zanzibar, where a tourist discovered that some shadows cast by market stalls belong to things that shouldn't exist. The third brings us to Ghana, where a security guard's routine patrol turned into a nightmare that challenged everything he believed about reality. And our final story comes from South Africa, where even the government once officially acknowledged that some things can't be explained by conventional means. These stories share common threads: empty markets, the darkness between closing and dawn, and encounters with entities that exist in the spaces between our world and theirs. In every case, the people involved were skeptics before their experiences. They were rational, educated individuals who had explanations for everything, until they didn't. Before we begin, understand this. In African cosmology, the supernatural isn't separate from reality, it's woven into the fabric of everyday life. What Westerners might dismiss as superstition, millions of Africans understand as fact. The spirits, entities, and forces you're about to encounter aren't characters in stories. They're active presences that share our world, especially in places where human energy has accumulated over generations. So as we explore these empty markets together, remember that darkness falls the same way everywhere. But in Africa, when the market's empty and night settles over ancient trading grounds, you might discover that you're not walking alone. Let's begin. Aduni Okafor was a third-year engineering student at the University of Lagos when she made the mistake that nearly cost her everything. She was brilliant, pragmatic, and completely immune to what she called village superstitions. Growing up in Lagos, she'd heard the old stories about night markets and spiritual dangers, but to her, they were relics of a less educated time. The Alaba International Market was where her grandmother had sold fabrics for 30 years. After her grandmother's death in 2018, Aduni inherited the small stall and planned to sell it, but first, she needed to collect some personal items her grandmother had left behind: family photos, traditional jewelry, and accounting books that might help establish the stall's value. The problem was timing. Between classes, part-time work, and thesis preparation, Aduni could only visit the market late at night. When she mentioned this to her mother, the older woman's face went pale. "The Adza," her mother whispered, using the Yoruba name for the ancient creature. "They hunt in empty markets. You cannot go at night." Aduni rolled her eyes. Her mother often mentioned the Adze vampiric spirits from neighboring Ghana that could take the form of fireflies to enter homes and feed on sleeping victims. According to legend, they were especially drawn to markets where many people gathered during the day, feeding on the residual energy after dark. "Mama, it's 2018, Aduni laughed. "I'm studying engineering, not folklore." On a humid Tuesday evening in August, Aduni took a taxi to Alaba Market around 11 p.m. The usually chaotic marketplace was eerily quiet, the corrugated metal roofs creating strange shadows under the few functioning streetlights. Security guards patrolled the main entrances, but the interior was a maze of darkness. Her grandmother's stall was deep in the textile section, row 47, stall 23. Aduni had visited it hundreds of times in daylight, but at night, even familiar paths seemed alien. She used her phone's flashlight to navigate between the narrow alleys created by closed stalls. As she walked, she noticed fireflies, dozens of them, dancing between the stalls in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. In her rational mind, she knew fireflies were common in Lagos during the rainy season, but something about these felt different. They moved with purpose, not the random flutter she expected. When she reached her grandmother's stall, Adoni unlocked the heavy padlock and stepped inside. The small space smelled of old fabric and her grandmother's favorite incense. Using her phone light, she began gathering the items she'd come for. That's when she heard the humming. It was soft at first, like a distant generator, but as she listened, it grew clearer, not mechanical, but organic, musical even, and it was coming from outside the stall. Through the gaps in the metal walls, she could see the fireflies gathering. Not scattered as before, but congregating in a dense cloud directly outside her grandmother's stall. The humming grew louder, and Aduni realized with growing unease that it seemed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, focusing on her task, but when she looked up from packing, one of the fireflies was inside the stall with her. It hovered at eye level, its light pulsing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Aduni stared at it, and for a moment she could swear she saw a tiny human face within the glow, ancient, patient, and hungry. "No," she whispered, backing toward the stall's entrance. "This isn't real." The firefly darted toward her, and instinctively, Aduni swatted at it. Her hand passed through empty air, but she felt something cold brush against her palm, something that made her skin crawl with an electric sensation. More fireflies poured into the stall through gaps she hadn't noticed. They surrounded her, their collective humming now loud enough to make her teeth ache, and in that supernatural light, she saw her grandmother's accounting books fall open on their own. The pages flipped rapidly, as if moved by invisible hands, stopping on an entry dated exactly 30 years ago. In her grandmother's careful handwriting, "Payment to Babalawo for protection charms, market growing dangerous at night, the old spirits wake." Aduni's blood ran cold. Below that entry, her grandmother had drawn symbols protective wards against spiritual attack, and at the bottom of the page, a note that made Aduni's knees weak. "They come as lights. Never trust the beautiful lights." The fireflies began to descend, and Aduni suddenly understood that these weren't insects at all. They were something else entirely, wearing the disguise of harmless creatures to get close to their prey. The Yu people of Ghana had warned about them for centuries, the Adze, vampiric entities that fed on human energy and could possess their victims. She grabbed the books and photos, stuffing them into her bag as the fireflies pressed closer. Their light was beginning to hurt her eyes, and she felt a strange drowsiness creeping over her. According to the legends, that's how they fed, inducing sleep and then draining their victims slowly. But her grandmother had been smarter than Aduni gave her credit for. Hidden behind a fold in one of the fabric samples was a small leather pouch. Aduni's fingers closed around it instinctively, and the moment she touched it, the fireflies recoiled. It was an ancient protection charm, probably blessed by a traditional healer decades ago. The fireflies' humming turned angry, discordant, and they began to circle faster, but they could no longer approach her directly. Aduni didn't wait to test the charm's limits. She ran from the stall, clutching the protective pouch, as the cloud of fireflies followed her through the market's dark corridors. They stayed with her all the way to the main gate, where the security lights and the presence of guards finally forced them to retreat into the shadows. The security guard who saw her emerge was an older Yoruba man who took one look at her terrified face and the protective charm in her hand and nodded knowingly. "The small lights try to take you," he said in accented English. "Your grandmother, she was wise woman. She prepared for this day." Aduni never returned to the market at night. She sold the stall through a daylight broker and kept her grandmother's protection charm. She also started researching traditional African spirituality with the same rigor she applied to her engineering studies, because sometimes the old knowledge exists for very good reasons. Marcus Johansson was a 28-year-old anthropologist from Denmark who came to Zanzibar in 1995 to study traditional Swahili trading practices. He was documenting how ancient merchant families had maintained their commercial networks across the Indian Ocean for centuries. What he didn't expect was to become part of one of the most terrifying mass hysteria events in modern African history. The timing of his visit couldn't have been worse. March 1995 was when the Popobawa first appeared in Stone Town, having already terrorized the island of Pemba for weeks. But Marcus, focused on his research and skeptical of local superstitions, dismissed the growing panic as anthropological curiosities. Popobawa, literally batwing in Swahili, was described as a shape-shifting shetani, evil spirit that attacked people in their sleep. Unlike typical folklore, this entity had a disturbingly specific MO. It would physically assault its victims, often sexually, before vanishing. What made it particularly terrifying was its supposed ability to become enraged when people denied its existence. Marcus was staying in a small guest house near Creek Road, close to the old Dow Harbour, where Arab merchants had traded for over 1,000 years. His research required late-night interviews with elderly traders who preferred to meet after the day's business was done. This meant walking through Stone Town's ancient market areas well after dark, something that had become increasingly dangerous as Popobawa panic spread. On the night of March 31st, 1995, Marcus was returning from an interview with a retired spice trader when he decided to take a shortcut through the Darajani market area. During the day, it was Stone Town's busiest marketplace, filled with vendors selling everything from fresh fish to hand-carved furniture. At night, it became a labyrinth of empty stalls and dark passages. As he walked through the market's central corridor, Marcus noticed something odd about the shadows. Despite the weak street lighting, some shadows seemed deeper than they should be, dark spaces that appeared to move independently of their sources. He stopped to observe what he assumed was a trick of light and perspective. That's when one of the shadows detached itself from a spice vendor's stall and began moving toward him. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, too tall, too angular, with what looked like wings folded against its back. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made Marcus's anthropological mind struggle to categorize what he was seeing. The shadow approached to within 10 feet before stopping. Marcus could feel its attention like a physical weight, though he couldn't make out any features in the darkness. The air around him grew thick and oppressive, carrying a scent like sulfur mixed with rotting fish. Then he heard his name. Marcus. The shadow whispered in perfect English. You don't believe in me. The voice was wrong too deep, echoing from multiple directions at once. Marcus's rational mind tried to explain what was happening. Heat stroke, perhaps, or some kind of hallucination brought on by the stress of fieldwork in an unfamiliar culture. I study belief systems, Marcus replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. I don't participate in them. The shadow seemed to grow larger, more solid. Your disbelief makes you perfect. That's when Marcus understood he was in serious danger. Not from a supernatural entity, he still didn't believe in those, but from whatever psychological or social phenomenon was driving the Popobawa panic. If someone was using the hysteria to commit real crimes, a foreign researcher alone in a dark market would be an ideal target. He began backing toward the market's main entrance, keeping his eyes on the shadow, but as he moved, he realized other shadows were moving too. The entire market seemed to be alive with shifting darkness, shapes that detached from stalls and walls to circle him. Marcus broke into a run. The shadows followed him through the twisting market passages, their movement accompanied by a sound like heavy canvas flapping in wind. He could hear them behind him, around him, sometimes ahead of him, as if they were coordinating to cut off his escape. He burst from the market onto Creek Road, gasping and sweat-soaked. Streetlights had never looked so welcoming. But when he turned back to look at the market entrance, the shadows were still there, pressed against the boundary where darkness met the artificial light. For several long minutes, Marcus stood under the streetlight, watching those impossible shadows writhe at the edge of illumination. Then, one by one, they melted back into the market's depths. Marcus hurried back to his guest house, where he found the owner, an elderly Omani man named Saeed, sitting on the front steps with several neighbors. They were burning incense and speaking in low, worried voices. You were in the market? Said asked, taking in Marcus's disheveled appearance. Yes, Marcus admitted. I saw something. Shadows that moved wrong, Said nodded grimly. Popobawa hunts there now. 3 people attacked this week. 1 died. Marcus learned that the one who died was a mentally disabled man who'd been beaten to death by a mob convinced he was Popobawa in human form. The incident had occurred just 2 days before Marcus's encounter, and the market had been largely empty since then, except for whatever Marcus had encountered in the darkness. For the rest of his stay in Zanzibar, Marcus avoided the markets at night. He completed his research during daylight hours and was careful never to express skepticism about Popobawa in public, because whether the entity was real or not, its effects certainly were. Marcus published his findings about traditional Swahili trading networks without mentioning his night in Darajani market, but privately he kept detailed notes about his experience, notes that would eventually contribute to academic studies on mass hysteria and the anthropology of fear. He never could quite explain what he'd seen that night, but he also never again dismissed the possibility that some folklore might be documenting real encounters with things science hadn't yet learned to measure. Because in Stonetown's ancient markets, where 1,000 years of human hopes and fears had soaked into the very stones, it was entirely possible that belief itself had the power to make shadows walk. Kofi Mensah had been a security guard at Kumasi's Kejetia market for 12 years before he encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about reality. Kejetia Market, one of West Africa's largest open-air markets, employed dozens of night watchmen to protect the thousands of stalls from theft. Kofi worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, patrolling the maze-like corridors where over 10 zero vendors sold everything from traditional kente cloth to imported electronics. In 12 years, Kofi had seen his share of strange things. Petty thieves, wild animals that wandered in from the outskirts of the city, occasional fires, and yes, the usual rumors about spirits and traditional medicine. But he was a practical man, a Methodist who trusted in modern security methods over ancient superstitions. That changed on the night of October 15th, 2003. The evening had started normally. Kofi made his usual rounds, checking locks, shining his flashlight into dark corners, and occasionally chasing off street children who tried to sleep in the covered sections. Around 2 a.m., he was patrolling the traditional medicine section rows of stalls where herbalists sold everything from healing herbs to items that claimed to offer spiritual protection. This section always made Kofi slightly uncomfortable. Even locked up for the night, the stalls seemed to emanate an energy that made his skin crawl. The Akan people of Ghana had practiced traditional medicine for centuries, and much of what the herbalists sold walked the line between healing and what others might call witchcraft. As Kofi rounded a corner between 2 rows of medicine stalls, his flashlight illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. A small figure crouched beside one of the locked stalls. The figure was no more than 3 feet tall, with greyish skin and disproportionately long arms. It was methodically breaking into the stall's storage area, pulling out packets of dried herbs and small bottles of liquid. When Kofi's light hit it, the creature turned toward him with bright, malicious eyes. "Hey," Kofi shouted in Twi. "What are you doing?" The creature grinned, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. Then it spoke in perfect Twi, "Taking what was promised to me." Kofi had heard descriptions of the Tokolosha, a dwarf-like creature from South African folklore that was said to be used by witches to carry out their bidding. But the Akan people had their own version, Maja, forest spirits that could be bound by powerful traditional healers to perform tasks both beneficial and malevolent. "You cannot be here," Kofi said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is protected property." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Protected by what? Your uniform? Your flashlight?" It held up a small vial it had taken from the stall. "This market belongs to the old powers. We have always been here." Kofi reached for his radio to call for backup, but the creature moved with impossible speed. In seconds, it had scrambled up a support pillar and disappeared into the market's corrugated roof structure. Kofi could hear it moving above him, scampering across the metal sheets with chittering sounds that suggested it wasn't alone. He should have left then. Protocol demanded that he report unusual incidents to his supervisor and request additional guards. But Kofi was curious now, and perhaps a little afraid that no one would believe him if he couldn't provide more evidence. He followed the sounds across the medicine section, tracking the creature's movement by their footsteps on the roof. They seemed to be heading toward the market's oldest section, where traditional leaders had first established trading rights over 600 years ago. In this area, some of the stalls were built around massive trees that predated the market itself. The Akan people considered these trees sacred, homes to ancestral spirits that watched over commerce and protected honest traders. As Kofi approached the largest tree, his flashlight beam caught movement in its branches. The tree was full of them, dozens of the small creatures, moving through the branches like a troop of monkeys. They were harvesting something from the tree itself, strips of bark, leaves, perhaps even insects. And they were chanting in a language Kofi didn't recognize, though the rhythm was hauntingly familiar. At the base of the tree, more creatures worked at what looked like a small shrine. They were arranging the items they'd stolen from the medicine stores into patterns, mixing liquids in a large calabash gourd and burning herbs that filled the air with acrid smoke. Kofi realized he was witnessing something ancient and powerful, a ritual that probably predated the market, possibly even the city itself. These weren't random creatures causing mischief. They were spiritual entities carrying out some kind of traditional ceremony, using the market as their gathering place. One of the creatures noticed him watching and alerted the others with a sharp whistle. The chanting stopped, and dozens of bright eyes turned toward Kofi. He felt their collective attention like a physical force, pressing against his mind with an alien intelligence. "You see too much," said the creature he'd first encountered, dropping from the tree to land gracefully at his feet. But perhaps that is not accident. The creature reached into a small pouch and pulled out what looked like a cowrie shell. It pressed the shell against Kofi's forehead before he could react, and suddenly he understood what he was seeing. The ritual wasn't malevolent. The creature's Minamautia, as his grandmother would have called them, were working to maintain the spiritual balance of the market. They collected specific herbs and materials to create protective medicines that they would secretly distribute throughout the stalls, ensuring honest trade and protecting vendors from spiritual attack. They had been doing this for generations, working in partnership with certain traditional healers who left offerings and payment in their stalls. The market's reputation for fair dealing and prosperity wasn't just due to good business practices, it was actively maintained by these ancient guardians. "Why show me this?" Kofi asked. "Because the old ways are being forgotten," the creature replied. "Fewer healers leave proper offerings. More vendors bring cursed goods to sell. The balance weakens." The creature handed Kofi a small bundle of herbs tied with raffia. "Carry this. Tell the serious healers what you have seen. Some still remember the old contracts." Kofi took the bundle and immediately felt a warmth spread through his body, a sense of protection and connection to something larger than himself. When he looked up, the creatures were gone, vanished into the night as silently as they had appeared. He completed his patrol, but the rest of the night passed uneventfully. At dawn, when the first vendors began arriving, Kofi approached one of the traditional healers he knew and respected, an elderly woman named Nana Akosua, who had inherited her stall from her mother and grandmother. When he described what he'd seen and showed her the herb bundle, Nana Akosua's eyes widened with recognition and respect. "The MMO chose to reveal themselves to you," she said solemnly. "That is a great honor and a great responsibility." She explained that the partnership between the market's traditional healers and the forest spirits was as old as Kumasi itself. But as younger generations turned away from traditional practices and more vendors focused solely on profit, the spiritual protections that kept the market prosperous were weakening. Kofi began working as an intermediary, quietly alerting certain healers when he noticed spiritual disturbances during his patrols, and ensuring that offerings left for the Emamotia were protected from theft or destruction. The market's reputation for honest dealing and spiritual safety was maintained, though few people understood the ancient mechanisms that made it possible. Kofi never saw the MMOHer again in such numbers, though he occasionally caught glimpses of individual creatures during his rounds. They acknowledged him with nods or brief gestures, recognition between allies in the ongoing work of keeping the spiritual and commercial worlds in balance. Because in Ghana's markets, business and spirituality had never been separate concerns. They were different aspects of the same fundamental human need to trade fairly, prosper honestly, and maintain harmony between the seen and unseen worlds. Captain Cobus Jonker wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to investigate supernatural crimes. A veteran of the South African Police Service with 15 years of experience in serious and violent crime, he was methodical, skeptical, and thoroughly grounded in evidence-based policing, which made his appointment to head South Africa's Special Investigation Department of Supernatural Crimes all the more remarkable. The unit, officially established in 1992, was the world's first government-sanctioned supernatural investigation department. While most countries dismiss such reports as folklore or mental health issues, post-apartheid South Africa recognized that witchcraft-related crimes were real and deadly, requiring specialized response teams. In November 1999, Jonker received a case that would test everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between criminal investigation and the supernatural. Multiple vendors from Cape Town's Green Market Square had reported a series of incidents that followed an eerily consistent pattern. Someone or something was systematically visiting their stores at night, consuming merchandise, and leaving behind evidence that defied conventional explanation. The first report came from Miriam Naidu, who sold traditional African crafts and tourist souvenirs. She arrived at her stall one morning to find her entire stock of wooden animal carvings had been gnawed on not by animals, but by something with human-like teeth. Security footage showed nothing but shadows moving around her stall between 2 and 4 a.m. Within a week, 5 more vendors reported similar incident. Johannes Mbeki, who sold traditional medicines and herbs, found his most potent healing plants stripped bare, consumed entirely except for the roots. Sarah van der Mervo's beadwork store was ransacked, but only specific colors were taken, always red and black beads, left arranged in patterns that resembled traditional Zulu protective symbols. What elevated these cases from simple vandalism to supernatural investigation was the physical evidence that didn't make sense. Security cameras showed unexplained shadows, vendors reported temperature drops of 15-20 degrees during the incidents, and multiple witnesses described smelling the distinctive scent of impefo, sacred traditional burning herbs, despite no fires being lit. Captain Jonker approached the case with characteristic thoroughness. He interviewed each vendor extensively, reviewed all available security footage, and consulted with traditional healers to understand the potential spiritual significance of the targeted items. His investigation led him to focus on one particular stall, that of Nomsa Dlamini, an elderly Xhosa woman who sold traditional medicines and offered spiritual consultations. Unlike the other vendors, Nomsa's stall had never been touched, despite being located in the center of the affected area. When Jonker questioned her about this, Nomsa gave him a look that seemed to pierce straight through his professional skepticism. "The Umthakathi comes for what it needs," she said in accented English, "but it knows better than to take from one who serves the ancestors properly." Umthakathi, the ex-Xhosa word for a malevolent witch or sorcerer who uses supernatural powers for harmful purposes. Nomsa explained that someone was using traditional magic to send a spiritual entity to collect specific items needed for witchcraft rituals. The pattern of items taken, healing plants, red and black beads, wood from carved animals, were all components in traditional harmful magic. "This is not random theft," Nomsa told Jonker. "Someone builds power to harm others. The Isithunzala obeys, but it grows hungry." Isithunzala, a Zulu term for a supernatural familiar or spirit servant bound to do a witch's bidding. According to traditional belief, these entities could take many forms and would carry out their master's commands, but they required regular feeding with specific materials. Jonker realized he was dealing with something far more complex than vandalism. If someone was indeed practicing harmful witchcraft, using a spiritual entity to steal ritual components, the implications were serious. Traditional African law considered such practices tantamount to attempted murder, and South African courts had increasingly recognized witchcraft-related crimes as legitimate legal concerns. Working with Nomsa and other traditional healers in the area, Jonker developed a plan. They would set up a trap using the kinds of materials the entity seemed to prefer, but blessed with protective magic that would either repel the creature or force it to reveal its true nature. On the night of December 15th, 1999, Jonker and 2 other officers conducted surveillance of the prepared stall. They positioned themselves in concealed locations around Green Market Square, equipped with night vision equipment and blessed with traditional protective charms provided by Nomsa. At 2:47 a.m., the temperature around the stall dropped precipitously. Jonker's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the electronic equipment began malfunctioning. Through the night vision scope, he watched something emerge from the shadows. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The creature moved on all fours, but occasionally reared up on its hind legs to examine items with what appeared to be human-like hands. Its body seemed to shift and blur, as if it wasn't entirely solid. The creature approached the prepared stall and began examining the blessed items. The moment it touched them, it recoiled with what sounded like a shriek of pain. Bright flashes of light erupted around the protective charms, and the creature began to convulse and change form. For several minutes, it cycled through different shapes, sometimes animal, sometimes human, sometimes something that defied description. Finally, it stabilized into the form of a middle-aged man wearing traditional Zulu ceremonial dress. The man collapsed, unconscious but breathing. The officers approached cautiously. The man was alive and appeared to be in some kind of trance state. He carried no identification, but his body was covered with traditional scarification patterns and ritual scars that suggested extensive involvement in traditional practices. When the man regained consciousness at the police station, he claimed to have no memory of the previous several hours. He identified himself as Sipho Mthembu, a traditional healer from a township outside Cape Town. Medical examination revealed no evidence of mental illness or drug use, but psychological evaluation suggested he genuinely believed he had been possessed by a spiritual entity. The investigation that followed uncovered a complex network of traditional practitioners involved in both healing and harmful magic. Mthembu had apparently been hired by someone to create a familiar spirit for stealing ritual components, but the magic had gone wrong, leaving him trapped in spiritual bondage to the entity. The case was eventually resolved through traditional justice rather than conventional legal proceedings. A council of respected traditional healers conducted a cleansing ceremony that allegedly severed Mthembu's connection to the harmful entity. The nighttime theft stopped immediately afterward. Captain Jonker filed his report according to department protocols, documenting both the criminal aspects of the case and the spiritual elements that had been essential to its resolution. His conclusion was carefully worded but unambiguous. Certain criminal activities in South Africa involve spiritual elements that cannot be addressed through conventional law enforcement methods alone. Collaboration with traditional authorities is essential for effective investigation and resolution. The Special Investigation Department of Supernatural Crimes continued to operate until 2006, when changing political priorities led to its dissolution. But during its 14-year existence, it documented hundreds of cases where criminal activity intersected with traditional spiritual practices, creating an official record of phenomena that most governments refuse to acknowledge. Captain Jonker later wrote, "Whether you believe in supernatural forces or not is irrelevant. What matters is that millions of South Africans do believe, and their actions based on those beliefs create very real consequences in the physical world. As law enforcement officers, we have to deal with reality as it actually exists, not as we might prefer it to be. Because sometimes the most supernatural thing about a supernatural crime is that it gets officially documented, investigated, and resolved by people who understand that the world contains more mysteries than any single worldview can explain.